Okay, so we're going to pick it up pretty much where we left off with the development of covenantal resistance theory. Okay, so from here we actually need to move to France, where you have a series of wars of religion that take place. Now, to understand what happens here, I'm going to simplify a lot of history. Starting in the 1520s in France, you have a period that a prominent French historian by the name of Lucien Febvre called a period of magnificent religious anarchy. The state is officially Catholic, but there are all kinds of different reform movements percolating up. Some of them are Protestant, some of them are influenced by the Renaissance, all different kinds of things that are going on. This begins to change in the 1540s because of two things. First of all, Calvin. Calvin is beginning to write high-quality theological works in the French language, which is the first time that ever happened. Up to this point, pretty much all theology had been in Latin. But the second thing is that in the 1540s, the nobles begin to convert to Protestantism in increasing numbers, including many of the so-called princes of the blood, that is to say, members of the royal family. And they typically went toward, well, a Calvinist approach to Protestantism. So the nascent reform movement in France is taking an increasingly Calvinist character and is increasingly being led by nobles. Now, the majority of the Protestants in France are educated commoners, lawyers, goldsmiths, people like that. But the key people end up being the nobility. And that creates a problem, because in France, as in other countries in Europe in this time, the nobles had their own armies. And the crown, one of the oaths that the King of France took on his coronation was to fight heresy. And technically, well, the Protestants were heretics. But now we've got a problem that we've got heretics who have armies. In the 1530s, under Francis I, there was a crackdown on Protestants. And not to put too fine a point on it, but Protestants were frequently invited to become guests of honor at public barbecues. Now, in the 1540s, we've got this problem that you can't really do that so readily. So the Queen Mother, Catherine de' Medici, decides she needs to do something about this. And through her Chancellor, Michel de l'Hôpital, she negotiates a thing called the Edict of January. And the Edict of January basically said, okay, the nobles are allowed to have their own Protestant pastors and stuff in their households, in their townhouses and things like that, and granted the right of Protestants to worship under certain conditions around the kingdom. Now, a lot of the Catholics really objected to this, and there's a question on whether or not it actually qualified as legal, but nonetheless, the edict is promulgated. Now, there was a family called the Guise family. They were a very prominent family. They had included cardinals and dukes and things like that, and they were very, very much Catholic. They were very hardcore Catholic. And the Guises were really upset with the Edict of January. And as they were returning from Paris, heading home to their territory in Lorraine, they passed a village called Vassy. And in Vassy, there were a number of Huguenots who were meeting for worship in a barn. And you could always tell when Huguenots were worshiping because they were singing psalms. That's characteristic of the Huguenots. As a matter of fact, the Huguenots sang psalms when they were marching into battle. And there were actually Catholic generals who said that while the Huguenots were singing psalms, you could not beat them. Okay, so Guise heard this. He was really upset. Words were exchanged, and afterwards, gunfire. This is an illustration of the Guise attacking the barn where the Huguenots were worshiping at Vassy, in a period illustration. And there was a massacre of the Huguenots there. When this happens, the Protestants got really upset. And they began mobilizing their armies at the city of Orléans on the Loire River. And this is going to begin the first of the wars of religion in France. Next slide, please. The pattern of the wars of religion is really pretty simple. There's an unending, it seems, string of these things. What will happen is there will be a provocation, frequently by the Guises, like at Vassy, and that's going to cause the sides to mobilize, and there will be a war. The two sides will fight for a while until they basically get exhausted, and then there will be a truce declared that will give the Protestants either more or fewer rights to worship than they had before, depending on how well they did on the battlefield. And the truce will hold for a short period of time, then there will be another provocation, again, typically by the Guises, though they're not always, rinse and repeat. Okay? Cycle happens over and over again. This is exactly what Catherine de' Medici, the Queen Mother, had been trying to avoid. She wanted to have a united kingdom for her children. And so she decides, all right, well, how are we going to stop this? And so what she decides to do is to handle this following sort of normal diplomatic procedures. What do you do when you've got a conflict with another group? How do you settle this? How do you establish positive diplomatic relations with another group? You arrange a dynastic marriage. So what she did is she arranged a marriage between the technical head of the Protestant side, which was Henri de Bourbon, who is the king of a small country called Navarre, which is in southern France today. It originally straddled the Pyrenees, but the Spanish side of it had already been conquered by Spain. He was a prince of the blood. He was a very close relation of the royal family. So he is, by birth, he is the highest born member of the Protestant side, which makes him at least nominally the head of the Protestant side. So she arranged a marriage between him and her daughter, Marguerite, sometimes called Margot. So they arranged the marriage. A safe conduct is offered to the Protestants so that they could come to the wedding in Paris. Now, Paris is a very conservative Catholic city at this point. You wouldn't know it today, but it was in this period. And they don't really like the fact that all these Protestants are there, but the king has declared the safe conduct so that they're more or less willing to live with it, with one major exception: the Guises. It turns out that although Henry is actually, like I said, technically the highest born Protestant and therefore the head of the Protestant side, in practice, the head of the Protestant side was another prince of the blood who's the Admiral of France by the name of Admiral Coligny. He's older, he's more seasoned, he's more experienced, and Coligny was the guy who was really the effective leader of the Protestant side. And he was busy trying to get the king, Charles IX, he's saying to him, look, you want to rule the United Kingdom, this is what you need to do. Right now, there is a war going on in the Netherlands where the Dutch are busy revolting against the Spanish. The Spanish, by the way, are Habsburgs. They're your dynastic enemies. So the best thing that you can do, you can unite both the Catholics and the Protestants together to help the Dutch throw out the Spanish. Unite them against a common enemy, which happens to be your enemy as well. Oh, by the way, the people who are revolting happen to be Protestants, but let's not talk about that. The Guises really don't like this plan. They really don't like Coligny. And so in the middle of the safe conduct that they were given, the Guises attempt to assassinate Coligny. The guy who was hired to do this doesn't quite succeed. Coligny is hit but not killed. He's severely wounded. The Protestants are furious. I would say the Protestants are all up in arms, but they aren't quite at that level. I mean, we'd have to take that phrase very literally in this context. They are really furious. They feel like they've been betrayed by the king and everything else. Coligny is rushed to his apartments and they're busy trying to tend him. And Paris is on edge. It's a powder keg at this point. The royal family meets in council with the Guises, and they're trying to figure out what to do about this. They're afraid that with all the Protestants in the city, they're going to blame the royal family and attack and kill the king and the royal council. So in a panic, they decide that what they're going to do is finish off Coligny, announce that Coligny himself was involved in a plot against the king. Nobody else was involved, just Coligny. It isn't a broad-based thing. So Coligny was involved. Coligny is out of the picture now. It's taken care of. We can continue on as we were, just without Coligny, and we don't need to descend into another war. Thank you very much. So they assign Henry Guise to lead the group of town guardsmen to assassinate Coligny. And he says to them, "It is the king's will." They understand this as meaning it is the king's will to kill off the Protestants. And what begins is a general massacre on St. Bartholomew's Day, 1572, a general massacre of the Protestants in the city that's known as the St. Bartholomew's Day massacres. The accounts, Coligny is the first victim. The level of brutality is pretty astonishing. The bodies are thrown in the Seine River. They wash up on an island called the Allée des Cygnes, Swan Alley. And when word goes through the rest of France, copycat massacres occur across the country. Estimates vary, but 20,000 seems to be a pretty conservative number of the number of Protestant victims of the massacres. Not surprisingly, this triggers another war of religion. And there will be another cycle of these things. Now, this has got a couple of effects. One of them is that all of the older, more experienced Huguenot leaders are now dead, leaving the movement in the hands of younger hotheads. And it's in the context of this, 1572, the Vindiciae contra Tyrannus that I mentioned before, was written 7 years later. It was published 7 years later. You get people who are beginning to argue for things like, well, here's the question. When does a legitimate king turn into an illegitimate tyrant? Well, let's go to the next slide. I think I've got this there. When does a legitimate king turn into an illegitimate tyrant? Maybe when he starts massacring his own people. Maybe that might be a good indication. So what do you do when this happens? Well, if that happens, the king is now illegitimate. Violent resistance is therefore justified, up to and including regicide, up to including killing the king. And we're still led by the lesser magistrate. We still have to have this led by the lesser magistrate. Private people don't have the authority to do this. But lesser magistrates, in this case, we've got a lot of nobles who are still Protestant, they can be leading this. Now, Henry Bourbon, Henry of Navarre, who married Marguerite, he is pressured into converting to Catholicism to save his hide. He eventually escapes. He's functionally kept captive. He eventually escapes, returns to the Protestant side, and begins leading the Protestant armies. He's actually a very underrated general. He actually succeeds in getting control of most of France. In the meantime, Charles IX dies. He's succeeded by his only surviving brother, Henry III of France. Henry III is a really weak individual. And weak individuals are far more dangerous than strong individuals. Weak individuals can tend to lash out in situations where a stronger individual would have the confidence not to do it. And Henry III ends up getting worried about the power of the Guise family and ends up assassinating the leader of the Guises, which turns the Guises against him and forces Henry III into the arms of Henry of Navarre. So now you have the King of France siding with the Protestants against the ultra-Catholics. This gets complicated, but work with me here. It turns out that a Catholic priest moves into the camp with Henry, the two Henrys. It's actually called the War of the Three Henrys. You've got Henry Guise on one side and Henry III and Henry of Navarre on the other. A Catholic priest comes in and assassinates Henry III for siding with the Protestants. Now, this is one of these times when you kind of scratch your head and you wonder if he was born this stupid or if he had to practice. Because the next in line for the throne, there are no more Valois. The Valois line dies out with Henry III. He has no legitimate children. None of his brothers have legitimate children, and he is the last son of Catherine de' Medici. There are no more Valois. What that means is the throne passes to the nearest male relative, who happens to be Henry of Navarre. The leader of the Protestant side inherits the throne of France because this guy assassinated the King of France because he was allied with the Protestants. Henry takes over most of France, but not Paris. Paris is holding out against him. And Henry knows he can't control France without Paris. He has Paris under siege, and he's got basically two choices. He can either destroy the city, or he can convert to Catholicism. He is reputed to have said, Paris is worth a mass, mass being the Catholic church service. Probably didn't actually say that. But in any event, he announces his conversion to Catholicism. The ultra-Catholics cry foul. They say, we've seen this before. He's not a real Catholic. Don't believe him. The people of Paris say, nuts to you. He says he's a Catholic, and they welcome him with open arms. And lo and behold, Henry starts a new dynasty. The Bourbon dynasty is Henry IV of France. The Guises had invited Spanish troops into France to fight Henry of Navarre. He unites the Catholics and the Protestants together to drive the Spanish out. And then in 1598, he issues the Edict of Nantes, which allows for limited rights of worship to Protestants within the country until such time as religious agreement is reached within the country. There's a lot that can be said about this. I'm not going to get into that. It actually has relevance for English history as well, particularly when Louis XIV revokes the Edict of Nantes. I'm not going to go into all that. That would take us too far afield. Okay, now, the key point here, though, is that through this, there are several Huguenot writers, including the author of the Vindicii, that are further developing the idea of resistance theory. They are taking what Luther wrote in the Torgau Memorandum, the basic idea there, and they are extending it into the broader situation of a kingdom that isn't really structured the way the empire was. Remember, the argument for the empire was that the emperor is put in place by election, and therefore the people who elect him have duty to oversee him. That's not true in France. In France, it's a hereditary monarchy. But they still take this idea of resistance by the lesser magistrate and apply it in France, despite the fact that the rationale that got Luther to propose this no longer holds. Further, they take it to the next step and say resistance is legitimate even to the point of tyrannicide or regicide, even to the point of killing the king when, if it becomes necessary, if the king becomes sufficiently evil that this is, in fact, needed. Okay. Now, the Huguenots, the development of resistance theory there is going to have a big influence on British resistance theory, which is what we're going to turn to next, if I remember my slides right. So, next slide. Okay. Not quite. I've done multiple versions of this thing, and so anyway, that's my excuse, and I'm sticking to it. We have during this period a rise in a new political theory called absolutism. Absolutism basically says that, well, it's really typically in the context of a kingdom, that the king is an absolute monarch. What the king says goes. What is, it is the ultimate centralization of power. The central authority of the state dictates what's important, dictates what is done. It has authority over every area of life. We see this, for example, in France. After Henry IV, actually, historically, he's one of the most popular kings in French history, but he ends up being assassinated by a deranged ex-monk by the name of Ravaillac. He's succeeded by his young son, Louis XIII. Louis XIII, in turn, has as his prime minister a little bit later, Cardinal Richelieu, whom I mentioned before. Richelieu is a cardinal in the Catholic Church. He does theology, but he is also very important politically. Richelieu is one of the key people who develops the political theory of absolutism. And in Richelieu's case, this is articulated by the phrase raison d'etat, which is usually translated into English as reason of state, but that really does nothing to communicate what it means. What raison d'etat says is that the needs of the monarchy, the needs of the central government, the needs of the state writ large, specifically the monarchy, supersede the needs or the interests of anybody else in the kingdom. So there's nobody that can claim any special rights or privileges or anything else against the king. The king can overrule anybody if it's in the interests of the kingdom. So you see this, for example, in France. France was, in some ways, almost like the Holy Roman Empire. You have these provincial governors that really they've got their own foreign policy. They're running things almost independently of the state, for the most part. They've got their own laws, law codes, and things like that. There's a certain amount of royal law, but they've got exceptions to it, and so on. One of the things that Richelieu does is he establishes a new office in France called the intendant. We would translate this probably as superintendent or something like that. Their job is to oversee the provincial governors and make sure that they don't do anything contrary to the interests of the king. Because otherwise, historically they could actually move in all kinds of different directions against the interests of the state. He wants to ride herd over them and bring them into true subjection to the interests of the monarch. The nobles claimed special exemption as well. Richelieu rode herd over those. Probably the most famous example of that is he banned dueling, which was something that the nobles considered a privilege that they had. Richelieu said, it's murder, you can't do it. Why do I mention that? If any of you have seen The Three Musketeers, you're familiar with that. You also have the Huguenots, by the way, who say, according to the Edict of Nantes, we have certain rights that are carved in stone that not even the king can revoke, because it says in terms of the edict that these are irrevocable until religious agreement is reached in the country. Richelieu says, oh, really? He provokes another war of religion, proceeds to use the royal army to reduce all the Huguenot strongholds, and then stops. He does not exterminate the Huguenots. He does not force them back into the Catholic Church. What he does is force them into direct dependency on the goodwill of the crown, so that they are no longer claiming special privileges or exemptions that the crown cannot touch. This is absolutism. The state is in control. The state, the central government, the king is in control of everything. Now, a variant on this, or one form that it takes, particularly in England, as it turns out, is the idea of the divine right of kings. The divine right of kings says that God has placed kings in complete authority over their kingdom. God gives the kings direct authority. This is, by the way, exactly 180 degrees opposite of covenantal theory. God has directly appointed the king as being in charge of the kingdom. And it is the king's obligation to obey God. It is the people's obligation to obey the king. If the king makes a mistake and tells the people to do something that God doesn't want them to do, that's in violation of God's will or God's intent or God's law or anything else, it is nonetheless the people's obligation to obey the king, because they are answerable to their obedience, for their obedience to the king, and the king is answerable for his obedience to God. Okay. That is the principle of the divine right of kings. It's a form of absolutism. Now, the thing that most people don't understand is that the reason why to some extent, the reason why both of these develop, and especially the divine right of kings develops, is because of the wars of religion. This is a way of trying to get control over the religious wars that tore apart Europe in the wake of the Reformation. You've got the Schmalkaldic Wars in Germany, which we didn't talk about. You've got the wars of religion in France. You've got the 30 Years' War across Central Europe. You've got later, the English Civil War. You've got all of these wars over religion that are taking place. How do you stop them? How do you stop people fighting over religion? Well, what you do is you say that the people don't have the right to make decisions about religion. That's the king's job. The people's job is simply to obey the king. So the divine right of kings is, in large measure, a response to the problem of the wars caused by religious pluralism. It is equally important to note that it is an early modern development. It comes up in the late 16th and especially the 17th century. It's not a medieval idea. The traditional idea, and what continues as a current within Europe, a countercurrent to absolutism, is called constitutionalism. Constitutionalism is based on the idea of limited government. There is like I said, it's the traditional view. It's a view that has been in place in Europe all through the Middle Ages. All government must be limited because no matter who you are, you're subject to original sin. You're subject to corruption. And further, no matter who you are, you're likely to make mistakes. No one can be trusted with unlimited power. Even if you're well-intentioned, you're likely to make mistakes. And no matter how well-intentioned you are, you're also a sinner. So there must be limitations on power, and these limitations are determined by, well, historically, it's an unwritten constitution that sets up a balance of power, checks and balances, all of these kinds of things, and traditional limitations on power. It turns out that when you look at some of the so-called wars of religion that take place, many of them are actually rooted very much in this distinction between absolutism and constitutionalism. You can make a good argument that that is one of the undercurrents in the English Civil War. We always talk about the religious dimensions of it, but there is also a balance of power issue between the king, who's moving toward an absolutist idea of the state, and Parliament, which is very much a constitutional institution. The Dutch Revolt, which is seen in part as a religious war or a nationalist war, it pits a constitutional tradition in the Netherlands against an absolutist tradition coming out of Spain. The 30 Years' War pits a traditional constitutional understanding of government on the Protestant side against an absolutist Habsburg approach on the Catholic side. So this is an undercurrent even in the religious wars. This is a major theme in the politics of the period. Particularly as we're moving through the late 16th and into the 17th century, the constitutional side is pretty much inevitably Protestant. Absolutist side is Catholic and some Protestant, like, for example, the King of England. The constitutional side, as Protestant, is almost entirely rooted in the idea of covenant. This idea of covenant coming out of Calvin and the Calvinist tradition that sets up this idea of the king having responsibilities to the people and vice versa, and therefore limitations on royal power. Next slide. When you get into Britain then, the British resistance theory is always anchored in these covenantal ideas, but it moves in a different direction from what you see happening in the continent. The first two, John Coynet and Christopher Goodman, are writing during the period of the so-called Marian exiles. Henry VIII is King of England. He breaks with Rome. When he dies, he's succeeded by Edward, who is a Protestant. When Edward dies, he's succeeded by his half-sister Mary, who is Catholic. Mary begins persecuting Protestants. Protestant leaders especially flee England. Many of them end up in Geneva. These are known as the Marian exiles. John Poinet and Christopher Goodman are among the Marian exiles. Poinet is going to be the first person that we have during the Reformation who is going to write a treatise in 1556, way before the Huguenots actually, that justifies tyrannicide, justifying killing monarchs who are tyrants. He has Mary in mind. Christopher Goodman in 1558 is going to be the first person who is going to write a treatise, and this is going to be a trend in Britain, who is going to argue that the right of resistance isn't lodged in the lesser magistrate, it's lodged in the people. This is an important shift. By the way, Goodman in 1558, this is the same year that Mary will die. And he and John Knox were good friends. John Knox, in 1558, published a book against Mary, against Catherine de' Medici, several other Catholic queens. It was called The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women. Rather than attacking them for being tyrants, he attacked them for being women. And how evil it was to have women rulers. Mary died and Elizabeth came on the throne the same year. Elizabeth, good for her, never forgave either Goodman or Knox, with the result that Knox failed in his ambition to be an English reformer and became the reformer of Scotland. In any event, though, Goodman is really important here. I mean, Poinet, like I said, interesting because he's the first person who's actually arguing that tyrannicide is justified. Goodman is important because he's the first person we got that is arguing, and this is going to become a trend in Britain, that resistance, the right of resistance lodges with the people. And by the way, when I say Britain, I mean England and Scotland both. Okay. Why is resistance lodged in the people? Well, this is actually a more consistent application of covenant theories of government than lesser magistrate is. Why? The covenant exists between the king and the people, not between the king and the lesser magistrates. So if the king violates the covenant, the people are the ones that are harmed by this, and they are the ones who have the right to resist. That's the line of reasoning. So Goodman is going to be making this argument. That will be picked up by George Buchanan. He talks about it in terms of private resistance, the right of private individuals to resist, as opposed to public individuals. Buchanan says it's better if the lesser magistrate leads the resistance, but if the lesser magistrate fails in his job, then private individuals have the right to pick up the slack. Okay? And again, all of this is in the context of the king violating the covenant. Okay, I didn't list this here, but again, the fact that I'm talking about covenantal resistance, it has to do with the idea of the king violating the covenant. Then you get Samuel Rutherford, who is probably the most famous of these people, wrote a work called Lex Rex, The Law is King. And what he argues is that authority from God lodges in the office, not in the person. That's an important distinction. And as a result, if the person violates, in American terms, their oath of office or something like that, if the person breaks the covenant, removing the person from office is not an attack on the office. It is not an attack on monarchy, because the authority resides in the office, and the person, by violating their duty, is not actually fulfilling their office properly. So you can remove them without hurting the office itself. It's sort of like, in the presidency, if you think about impeachment, if we ever actually succeeded in impeaching a president, which has not happened yet, Removing an individual from the office of the presidency doesn't, in principle, hurt the office of the presidency. Another person steps in and the president continues to have all the same responsibilities. That's the same concept that Rutherford is working with. If you remove the king from office, it doesn't hurt the monarchy. The office of the king still stands. There's actually, without getting into it, there's actually an earlier precedent for this in France, where the way they thought about the king as well. The office of the King of France in medieval Europe, medieval thought, was that the King of France was eternal in one sense, and there were different individuals that just sort of embodied that office as you went along. Same similar kind of concept here. Rutherford, however, in any event, is not going to agree with private resistance. He's going to argue that resistance needs to be led by lesser magistrates. The point here is that in Britain we have a different and frankly a more radical understanding of Protestant resistance theory. Like I said, they're the first ones that go to tyrannicide, although this is going to, with the Huguenots, this is going to have a big influence in England later on. They do, after all, behead Charles I. Along with that, though, you have this move toward private resistance, which you don't see on the continent. I haven't found anybody on the continent that actually, or there's probably somebody, but I haven't found anybody yet who argues for private resistance. Overwhelmingly, that's lesser magistrate. The English are actually more consistent, though, like I said, with the covenantal idea here, because the covenant is with the people. It isn't with the lesser magistrates. Okay, next slide. Now, in England, absolutism takes a couple of different forms. The most famous of these is Thomas Hobbes with Leviathan. I talked about this a little bit yesterday. Again, Hobbes used the term Leviathan because of actually a misunderstanding of the etymology of the name Leviathan. It was believed in this period that it came from two Hebrew words that referred to lava, which means something like connecting or bringing together, and tanin, which is a word that translates to either serpent or dragon. And they were trying to figure out what this meant. And so on one hand, they thought maybe it meant that Leviathan was a monster that was so big that it was almost like it had to be two separate things, but it was so big it was really only one. But it was hard to imagine how it could be because it was so large. Or it was maybe the name came from the fact that the scales on the monster were so tightly compacted together that that was what the name referred to. That the scales, the scales were really so tight you couldn't separate them. And it's that second meaning, I didn't explain this adequately last night, but it's that second meaning of the scales being tightly together that Hobbes is working with. So you see the picture, this is again the cover picture on the book. All of the things on the body there are pictures of individuals, but they're like the scales of Leviathan. They're all compacted together, very closely together, to create the body of, well, the monster, or in this case, the body politic, the body of the nation. But the head of the thing is not made up of a lot of different people. It's a single head, it's the king. So the idea here is that the king is literally the head of the body politic. He's the head of the nation. He is the head over all of the people. And thus, it's an absolutist position. The king is in charge of everything that happens in the country. Anywhere where the king wants to exercise his authority, he exercises it. Hobbes argues that this the king should even decide matters of religion. He says, now, ideally, the king should promote Christianity. I'm not sure how serious Hobbes was about that, but in any event, he says, ideally, the king should promote Christianity, but one way or another, the king makes those decisions because the king is the head of the body. And if the king makes a mistake, it's on him. So this is, like I said, this is actually the most famous work of absolutism in England. And it's the one, of course, that I used for the idea of the title of the book, Slaying Leviathan. The way I would apply this is I would change the image of Leviathan as a sea serpent with these tightly woven scales and turn it more into a squid or an octopus or a Cthulhu or something with tentacles, because the tentacles extend into every area. It's the idea of a totalitarian government, okay? You can't truly have totalitarianism without modern technology, but that's what these guys were talking about, something very much like that, where the power of the government extends into every area of life. Now, it turns out that although Leviathan is the one that's most remembered today and most discussed, there's another work that's really important from Sir Robert Filmer called Patriarcha, published in 1680. Leviathan's a bit earlier, 1651. Patriarcha, you see the root patriarch in there. Filmer's argument, in essence, was that Adam was an absolute patriarch over his children. Adam had absolute authority over all of his children, and he passes this authority down to the eldest child. And by this process, the eldest child ends up having authority over their children and so on. And what ends up happening then is fundamentally the kings are the heirs of Adam's authority. And just like Adam was an absolute patriarch over his children, the king is an absolute patriarch over his children, metaphorical children in the kingdom. It's another way, it's another argument about absolutism, anchoring it in a particular reading of Genesis. Now, the reason I wouldn't bother with Filmer at all, he doesn't really go very far, except I have to mention him because it turns out that when John Locke writes his 2 treatises on government, he actually writes them specifically against Filmer. In a lot of ways, Leviathan is old news by the time Locke is writing. Filmer is much more recent. So he's the one Locke feels like he needs to respond to. So let's go to the next slide and talk about Locke. Locke is a really interesting character. He grew up as a Puritan, but he was influenced by some Enlightenment debates over over Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch that moved him toward a kind of liberal Protestantism. And he was a brilliant guy in a lot of ways, really influential, and in a lot of ways really wrong about a number of things. For our purposes, though, what we're interested in are his 2 treatises on government. These were written in the wake of the Glorious Revolution in England, and they really provide a sort of theoretical justification for what happened during the Glorious Revolution. Not going to get into that. But Locke's genius in this particular case isn't found in his originality. He's very original in a number of other areas. But his genius here is that what he does is he draws together a number of the strands of Christian political theology that we've talked about into a coherent whole for the first time. So what he says is, he brings together the idea of unalienable rights. And from the Middle Ages, he draws the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and property. He gets there in a different way, though, than what we saw before. So life is, again, let's go to the Garden of Eden. Life is obvious from the Garden of Eden. Liberty, we already talked about, again, anchored in the garden. Property, what does he say about property? His argument for property rights is called the labor theory of property, which is different from the labor theory of value, which is something that's talked about more. But the labor theory of property goes like this. When you work on something, when you take a resource and develop it, we have a glass blower here. When you work on it, you put something of yourself into it, okay? Just by simply developing it, working on it, plowing the field, growing crops, whatever you're doing, you are putting something of yourself into it. And since you are putting something of yourself into it, you have a right of ownership of what is produced. Okay? Because part of you is in what you are producing there. Therefore, there's a right of ownership anchored in what you do, in the fact that you were putting yourself into it. Now, Locke added a couple of caveats in it. You can't have a monopoly. So in other words, your right of ownership must be done in such a way that it doesn't preclude other people having a right of ownership as well. So there are certain limitations here. But because of that, because you're putting something of yourself into your work, the products of your work belong to you. Now, he didn't do it this way, but you can also get this out of the Garden of Eden. What does God tell Adam to do? Tend the garden. You're to make sure that the garden is productive. And what that means, tend the garden, eat the fruit. What that means is as you tend the garden, as you're producing things from the garden, as you're cultivating the trees, as you're pruning them, as you're making sure they're productive and stuff like that, you are literally entitled to the fruit of your labor. Okay, so that's basically the core of Locke's argument. He doesn't go to the garden for that, but that's essentially the idea here. He does it on the basis of putting some of yourself into it. I think the simpler way of doing it is just what I said. Tend the garden, eat the fruit. Okay. So Locke is going to see these three rights as being unalienable. They're rights that, and he will talk about them as being God-given. Okay. Now, so we have those. He adds to that the contract theory of government. Now, notice I said contract, not covenant, because Locke is already moving toward a more secular Enlightenment-inspired vision here. And so he's going to take Calvinist covenant theory and he's going to be turning it more contractual, more secular. But it's basically the same sort of thing. Government consists of a contract between the government and the people. Doesn't even need to be a king here, but the government and the people. And the core of that contract is that the government exists to protect the people's unalienable rights. So at that point, for the first time, we are clearly, the unalienable rights that I talked about yesterday that I haven't come back to, those unalienable rights we talked about last time, this is the first time they're being integrated into this idea of government. And they're integrated into it at this point that the contract between the government and the people, its primary purpose is to protect their unalienable rights. And this leads to all kinds of things. You have an unalienable right to property, therefore the government must protect your right to property, therefore it must protect you against theft. And it must punish those who steal. It must punish murderers, and so on. Now, if the government fails to carry out the contract, in other words, if the government does not protect your unalienable rights, or worse, if the government itself violates your unalienable rights, then the people have the right to resist. This is again coming out of British resistance theory, because the contract is between the king and the people, or the government and the people. When the government violates the contract, the people have the right to revoke it. They have a right to resist, to replace the contract with the government with a contract with a different government that they think is more likely to protect their rights. So the right of resistance here literally refers to changing the government. Okay? So that's Locke's argument. If the government fails to protect your unalienable rights, it violates its side of the contract, and therefore you have the right, the people have the right the contract's already been broken, people have the right to revoke the contract and establish a new contract with someone they think is more likely to protect their rights. Okay, next slide. If you want a quick summary of this, look at the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson is paraphrasing Locke here. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I'll get back to pursuit of happiness in a moment. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Sound familiar? By the way, this is properly punctuated. Frequently, people put a period there. It's a comma in the original. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. All of these are according to Jefferson, self-evident truths. That's Locke. That's a summary of the two treatises of government. That's a summary of his argument. There's only one major change there, and that is pursuit of happiness instead of property. So just a word about that. Happiness doesn't mean to Jefferson what it means to us. To Jefferson, Jefferson is very familiar. Jefferson was arguably one of the best educated people we've ever had in the presidency. Actually, probably unarguably. And he was very, very familiar with Aristotle, and particularly for our purposes right now, the Nicomachean Ethics. And in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle talks about a concept he calls eudaimonia, the Greek word, which was translated in the 18th century into English as happiness. So what he's referring to here is the pursuit of eudaimonia, the pursuit of happiness in the Greek sense of the word. So what's eudaimonia? Eudaimonia refers to, basically, it is a life well lived. It is a life that is truly, in a deep sense, satisfying, a good life in the full sense of that word. And this means a life of virtue. It means a life lived according to rational principles, which are, those rational principles lead to a life of virtue, in other words. It is a life that is not lived by emotion, because emotion may give you momentary happiness, in our meaning of the word, but it will not give you the deep satisfaction that comes from living a life of virtue and a life governed by reason. And in fact, according to Aristotle, achieving this eudaimonia, this virtuous, well-lived life, is the goal of human life. It is the fundamental purpose of our lives. So what Jefferson is saying here with the pursuit of happiness is that government, one of our unalienable rights, is our ability to pursue the purpose of our creation, the purpose for which we were made, the goal of every human life. Now, Adams apparently tried to convince Jefferson to change this to property. Jefferson refused, because Jefferson was far more of an intellectual, and he wanted to get a bit of Aristotle in here. But actually, he snuck property in through the back door, because it turns out that in order to achieve eudaimonia, Jefferson was equally clear that you had to have property, because you can't pursue this kind of life without resources. And for Jefferson, by the way, that meant land. Jefferson was a big believer in having your own land, working your own land, and all of that. Because he says there are things that you learn and a kind of character you develop when you're cultivating your own land that promotes eudaimonia. He really distrusted people in cities. He referred to them as the swinish masses, and really doubted that they'd ever have the ability to govern themselves because they don't have the kind of virtues that you develop from working your own land. So he sort of snuck property in the back door. But when he talks about pursuit of happiness, that's what he means by that. Okay, so this becomes the foundation and the justification for the American Revolution. He then gives a whole list of ways that King George violated his contract to protect these unalienable rights, and therefore we are justified in abolishing the government and instituting a new one. Next slide. Now, I would argue that, at least with respect to the themes of political theology that we've been talking about, that the American Revolution and the Constitution that follows it are, in fact, the culmination of these trends in Christian political theology. And the best way of understanding why is to contrast what happens in the American Revolution and the Constitution with what occurs in the French Revolution. Okay, so in America, you can actually, there are three revolutions that are actually worth looking at. The first is the Glorious Revolution in England, which I didn't talk about, happens in 1688. Glorious Revolution in England is what I would call a conservative revolution. Basically, what they were trying to do is preserve what they thought of were the traditional values of England that they saw as being under attack. So it's conservative. It's trying to get rid of people who they're afraid are going to undermine traditional British values. The American Revolution is a moderate revolution. There are things from England that they value, that they actually respect. There are elements of English law and traditional English, like I said, values, customs, legal principles, and things like that, that they want to preserve. So they're not throwing everything out wholesale. There are other things that they want to get rid of. They want to get rid of the king. They want a republic. They want to get rid of nobility, no titles of nobility. There are a whole bunch of things like that that they do want to get rid of. So they want to keep some parts of it and get rid of others. So it's a moderate revolution. It's not like it's trying to clean sweep everything. But there are also elements of it that are drawn very directly from the Augustinian tradition, Augustinian pessimism. This is coming in from Augustine to Calvin to the Puritans to the Founding Fathers. There is a real fundamental distrust of the government that is embedded in the Constitution. The system of checks and balances that we talk about is really based on the idea that no individual and no institution can be trusted with absolute power. Now, I talked yesterday about the government being an Aristotelian mixed state, the monarchical principle in the president, the aristocratic principle in the Senate, the Republican principle in the House. The judiciary, by the way, stands on the side and it's supposed to play a referee. Turns out that it hasn't exactly worked that way. Jefferson was worried about that, and Jefferson was right on this one. The original principle here, this is the way the checks and balances system is supposed to come in. The original principle here was that each institution, the presidency and the executive branch, the Senate and the House, each of them would be jealous for their own power and prerogatives. The idea is to use self-interest and original sin against itself. So that if the president starts trying to overstep his authority, the House and the Senate will look and say, wait a minute, he's encroaching on our territory, and they'll double team him. If the Senate does it, the president and the House will. If the House does it, the Senate and the president will. The idea is that people will be loyal to the branch of government that they are in and will act to defend its power and prerogatives. That's how the system of checks and balances was designed to work. But there's a problem. When the Constitution was written, there was no provision for political parties. And the reason for that was they understood from long history of Renaissance and medieval republics that the thing that was most dangerous to a republic was what they called a faction. Factions are the death of republics. And so they were doing their best to set up a system that didn't, and a party is a faction, frankly. They were doing their best to set up a system that wouldn't allow for factions. And the reason why factions are the death of republic is factions try to accumulate all power to themselves and then exclude those who aren't part of them. So the original system said that in an election for president, the one who got the most electoral votes was the president. The one who got the second highest was the vice president. So we would have President Biden and Vice President Trump. I'll be honest with you, this looks like a recipe for assassination. They realized pretty quickly that this didn't work, so an amendment was put in place that you have a slate running. You vote for both president and vice presidents together. But that opened the door for parties. And once you open the door for parties, the problem emerges very quickly that loyalty no longer goes to the branch of government that you're in, it goes to your party. And thus you begin getting alliances that don't, or not alliances, allegiances that don't go to the institution, but go to the party. And so the president, the House, and the Senate will work together if one party will work across branches, and checks and balances stop working. They knew that that would happen if you allowed parties. But once they had to allow slates for president and vice president, they held their breath and crossed their fingers and hoped it wouldn't happen. They knew that that would be the problem. And it turns out they were exactly right. And that's what we're seeing now. The checks and balances system doesn't work because of that problem. The only way we get checks and balances now is by having divided government, where at least one of the branches of government is in the hands of a different political party than the other two. Without that, there is no checks and balances. In any event, you also have ideals coming in from the Enlightenment. That's going to be an influence on the government. We have to be careful here. There are a lot of people who will tell you that the founders were all Christians. Nonsense. They weren't. There are other people who tell you that they were all deists. Nonsense. They weren't. As a matter of fact, I can't find a single true deist among the lot of them. Jefferson was a Unitarian rationalist. He wasn't a deist. Franklin probably comes closest, but you will find Franklin saying things that are completely inconsistent with deism. And even the deists and the Unitarian rationalists, even the most heavily influenced Enlightenment figures, Adams was a Unitarian as well, even the most heavily influenced Enlightenment figures were also heavily colored by Christianity. But you also find evangelical Christians among the lot. Rush, there are any number of them. So it's sort of a mixed bag. There was a book, blanking out on the author right now, it'll come to me as soon as I'm done speaking, called On Two Wings. And the argument was that the American eagle flies on two wings, the wing of Christianity and the wing of the Enlightenment. And that's actually correct. Both of them work together to create the American experiment. But even the Enlightenment wing, I would argue, is heavily influenced by Christian political theology all through this. Now, one last thing that needs to be said about the First Amendment. It's worth noting that the First Amendment is first for a reason, because the things stated in, well, first of all of the Bill of Rights are negative rights. They're restrictions on the state, not restrictions on us. And the rights guaranteed in the First Amendment are really foundational for all of the others. These are the most important, and frankly, the other rights are there to support and protect those of the First Amendment. The first right in the First Amendment is the most important of those rights. Congress shall pass no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The word separation of church and state do not occur in the Constitution. That comes from a letter that Jefferson wrote to a bunch of Baptists in Connecticut who were afraid that the state of Connecticut was going to encroach on their right to worship. And Jefferson said, no, the Constitution establishes a wall of separation between church and state. Not in the Constitution. The way that that was understood is an established religion was a state religion. That's what that term meant in the 18th century. So Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion means that Congress at the federal level cannot set up a state church in the United States. It turns out that individual states could. There were established churches in a number of states in the United States. And the Constitution didn't affect that. They were later disestablished over time, but a lot of them extended into the 1800s. Why couldn't Congress do this? Well, there are a couple of practical reasons. One of them is, which church do you pick? Different states had different churches. If you tried to do a national church, you would alienate states. So Congress can't establish a religion nationally or prohibit the free exercise thereof, which means that not only can Congress not establish a national church, it can't prohibit churches. from existing. You can't pass a law against Baptists. That's really what Jefferson meant in his letter to the Danbury Baptists. That's what that means. And again, remember, it's a negative right. It's protecting us against what the state can do. What it is not saying is that the church can't influence the state. It is not saying that Christians do not have the right to lobby for their interests to the government. It is not saying that Congress can't have a chaplain. They do. I find it bizarre that people will argue that every group in the country has a right to lobby for their values and interests except Christians because First Amendment. That's utter nonsense, legally and logically and in every other way. So it's worth noting a little bit about, by the way, why is that our first freedom? Well, because fundamentally what that's saying is you have your right of conscience. If you don't have your right of conscience to believe and put it into practice, then what does it mean that you have the right of freedom of speech? If you can't say what you believe, what does that mean? What does it mean that you've got freedom of the press if you can't write what you believe? What does it mean that you have freedom of assembly if you can't assemble to express your beliefs in worship? It's foundational to everything else. That's why that's so critically important. Okay, so that's a little bit about America. Let's talk about France in contrast. I'm going to have to do this one kind of quick because I want to leave time for questions. Next slide, please. In France, you have a radical revolution. It's a complete rejection of the past. And in France, once again, church and state were very tightly intertwined, which meant that in France, they wanted to eliminate not just the monarchy. Well, actually, originally, they didn't want to eliminate the monarchy. They wanted to eliminate absolutism. They wanted a constitutional monarchy. Over time, they decided to eliminate that completely. But they definitely want to eliminate the church. And certainly, any role that the church might play in the state. It is a purely secular revolution. It is based on the idea of human perfectibility. This is sort of an Enlightenment idea. They're rejecting original sin. They're rejecting Augustinian pessimism. They believe that they can create a perfect state. As opposed to the US more perfect union, they believe they can actually create a perfect union, a perfect state. It's based on this idea that following Enlightenment principles, you can create perfect people. The result of this purely secular approach, influenced very heavily by one Jean-Jacques Rousseau, by the way, and those of you who listen to the podcast will know my attitude toward Rousseau, it leads to a period known as the Terror. This is the period when we think about the French Revolution, most often what we think about, the guillotine and all of that kind of thing. To put the Terror in perspective, at a place that is now euphemistically called the Place de la Concorde, roughly the place of peace, in Paris, they beheaded 1,961 people. And that was in only one location in Paris. Overall, during the French Revolution, over 250,000 people in France were killed. And that doesn't include in the wars that followed with foreign countries. That is the result of having an attempt at a purely secular revolution and a purely secular state. And you get a totalitarian, or what the closest they could get to a totalitarian government, particularly in the period under the Terror. Next slide. Legacy of the French Revolution. I've talked about Christian political theology and how it shaped so much of political thought in Europe leading up to this period. I've talked about the American Revolution and the Constitution as being sort of the culmination of this whole approach. The reason it's the culmination of this approach is the French Revolution. Because with the French Revolution, our entire way of thinking about politics changes. Politics is no longer tethered to theology in any way, shape, or form. It becomes a purely secular field. It's untethered from history. It's untethered from tradition. It's untethered from the idea that human nature is fixed. People are viewed as being infinitely malleable. You can change them into whatever you want them to be. And it's untethered from the idea that there are any objective or eternal truths about the world or about people. That has dominated political science ever since the French Revolution. And the effect of this is we see this in the descendants of the French Revolution, in Marxism and neo-Marxism, critical theory, and all of the things that flow from that. We see it in secularism in all its various forms. In France, it's called laïcité. But all of the insistence, in principle, what secularism says at its most basic level is the church shouldn't interfere with the state and vice versa. In practice, where secularism goes is it says that religion is fine, just keep it to yourself. It should play no role in public life. If you want to believe it, go ahead, just do it. Just keep it to yourself. This is why, by the way, people will say Christianity shouldn't play any role in public life. It's because we've adopted a secular vision. And this is, again, one of the legacies coming out of what we see happening with the French Revolution and modern ideas of politics. It's really, French Revolution changes the whole ballgame. Also, modern progressivism in all its various forms is also a descendant of the French Revolution. Next slide. So, what should we be doing as Christians? Well, this is on a theoretical level. I would say that what we need to do is recover a Christian political theology. We need to be thinking about politics through theological categories. And I have just a few of these here. But one of them is the centrality of the fact that human beings are made in the image of God, which means a couple of different things. I mean, I've got a short book on the image of God. I can go on for this for quite a while. But the most important part of this for us is that the fact that we're made in the image of God means that we have, each individual has incredible worth and incredible dignity. Not to put too fine a point on it, belittling any individual is quite literally insulting God to his face. Because if we have any form of bigotry, if we are racist, if we are sexist, if we hate Muslims, any of these things, any of these areas, or similarly, if we think we're superior because we're Christians or for any other reason, what we are saying is that that value structure that we're putting in place there, either holding people in contempt or building ourselves up, we are saying that those things are more important than the image of God in establishing human value. That is idolatry, and it is insulting God to his face. We need to remember that. And so the centrality of the image of God is absolutely critical, and it is that leads to things like unalienable rights. It is that leads to our social responsibilities to each other. Remember, the two great commandments are love God and love your neighbor. And both James and John make it clear that loving our neighbor means taking practical action to help our neighbor. One of the big problems that we have in our country today, and actually in almost all modern states today, is that we have subcontracted out our responsibility to our neighbor that God has given to us to the central government. And what that means is we get one-size-fits-none solutions. I read a study a while ago, these numbers are probably out of date, but when I read the study, it said that for every dollar that goes to the government for welfare, 85 cents goes to bureaucracy, 15 cents goes to helping people. For every dollar given to charities, 85 cents goes to the people, 15% goes to overhead. There are far more efficient ways of helping people's needs, of meeting people's needs. Further, you locally know more about your neighbor than Washington does, and you know better how to help your neighbor than Washington does. We need to recover, in the name of recognizing the image of God in our neighbor, we need to recover our sense of responsibility to our neighbor and begin acting on it, rather than subcontracting it out. That may not sound like part of political theology, but believe me, it is. We also need to recognize limits on government. Government needs to stay within its proper sphere. We need to stop asking the government to do things that it is not really qualified to do. This is where Kuyper comes in. Kuyper argues that there are a bunch of autonomous spheres: the family, education, business, labor, science, arts, and so on, government being one of those spheres. And each of these spheres should be operating autonomously, should be operating within its own self, governing its own affairs. The government exists, in some sense it's got responsibilities across them, but they're very limited. The problem is that when spheres stop functioning correctly, it's called collapsing. When a sphere collapses, another sphere has to step in to take over those responsibilities. But the other spheres aren't really equipped to do that. Most often the sphere that does that is government. And this is how government turns into Leviathan. Okay. It's also how governments turn tyrannical. So we need to recognize what the proper sphere of government is and encourage it to stay within its proper sphere. And to do that, one of the things we need to do is recover civil society. We need to recover intermediate institutions, not just the church, not just the family, not just schools, but other kinds of intermediate institutions to meet the needs within the community so the government doesn't have to. And that way government's tentacles will be more or less forced to withdraw because they will not be needed. This is the problem. I've already talked about the problem of overstepping. We need to remember original sin. The government is always going to be corrupt. And with this, we need to remember what's been called the political illusion, which is the idea that government is the solution for everything. There are certain things that the government is the solution for. There are things that properly belong to Caesar. But the vast majority of things we look for the government to do, they're not the solution. The solution is found elsewhere. And we need to recognize what the proper role of government is, support it in those roles, but I would argue, frankly, work to subvert it in the areas where it doesn't belong and replace it with something else that is better equipped to handle the needs that come up in those areas. Okay, so that's just sort of a broad theoretical way of looking at it. I overshot by 5 minutes where I had wanted to stop, but we got 25 minutes. I imagine that there are probably some questions that have come up through all this. So let's open it up for questions here.
Of course. Talk about the different spheres as someone who was educated before there was a Department of Education. The thing that I see is the more enlightened version of our public education. Instead of just educating, it's more, I don't know what it is.
Indoctrination?
Indoctrination, that was what I couldn't think of. And what should we do? I mean, obviously the simple thing would be to homeschool or everybody go to a Christian school, but that's not realistic the way we're set up right now. What should we do about that in your opinion?
Homeschool. I'll be honest with you, the university that I taught in started off as a normal school. A normal school is a technical term for basically what turns into a teacher's college. We were the best known school for teaching teachers, preparing teachers in the state of Connecticut. And frankly, our history department, which I taught in, was used, what we did for training teachers was used as a national model. We did a really good job with history. But when I look at what was done elsewhere by the education department and across the rest of the school, I frankly was rather appalled. I had students who would be in my classes who were rather shocked that I gave conservative ideas a fair shake and didn't force students to accept them. That I tolerated different ideas, those kinds of things. I had students telling me how other professors would grade them down if they disagreed with them on Middle Eastern politics, things like that. I saw firsthand in my students what was going on in the frank indoctrination that was happening to people who were going to be sent out into the schools. And you don't have to do much research to see the kinds of nonsense that's happening in a lot of elementary schools today, elementary schools, high schools. Now, I always get into trouble when I say this, because there are usually, when I'm speaking in a room, there are some people who teach, who are in public schools, who are teachers or whatever. What I would say, though, that if you have to work through the public schools, I would encourage you to attend school board meetings and run for the school board, because that's one way that you can affect policy within the schools and what is being taught. I would also pay very close attention to what the teachers are doing, because we have many examples of people who are actually going on TikTok and YouTube and saying, yeah, the school prohibits me from doing this, but I'm going to do it anyway. So you need to watch what is actually going on in the classroom, as well as, like I said, getting involved with the school board, either just at meetings or even running for position. That's really the only thing that the average parent or the average citizen can do to affect what's going on in public schools.
If everything that came out of the French Revolution was horrible, why has the trend gone to secular politics?
Well, to be honest with you, there were some positive things that did come out of the French Revolution. There was increased toleration for different religions. There was a much more fair law code that was put in place, and so on. So there were positive developments that did come out of it. You have a much more egalitarian and frankly meritocratic system that is spread across Europe by Napoleon as he's bringing the ideals of the revolution across. I focused on the things I did because in a lot of ways those represent the significant changes that happen in the way people think about politics. Politics, again, gets divorced from theology. It becomes a purely secular thing. And once you do that, there are dominoes that start falling. In practical terms, the revolution actually did do a number of positive things. I probably should have acknowledged that up front. But the theoretical change to the world of political thought is monumental, and in the long run, that proved, I would argue that proves to be really very, very detrimental.
I have a question. Does the First Amendment, when they were writing that, did they have Islam in mind? And does the First Amendment work with Islam?
Okay, first of all, they did not have Islam in mind. The interesting thing about the First Amendment, okay, broader cultural context. 1776 also sees the publication of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. The two of them are connected. The idea in Wealth of Nations is that the way national wealth is built is through free markets. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. There's a lot of interesting ideas in there and elaboration that you can go through here. But this idea of free markets is something that embeds itself deeply in culture. It turns out that political and economic systems tend to go together. Free markets are the foundation for republics. Why? Well, when I decide to buy an item at one store rather than the other, I'm voting that store into business. When I vote for one candidate rather than another, I'm buying what he's selling. They're parallel. The First Amendment is that applied to religion. We are going to have a free market of religion so that we're going to allow the different religions to compete with each other and let the best religion win. That is the thing that makes America so religiously dynamic compared to so many other countries, up until very recently. There was a sociologist of knowledge by the name of Peter Berger who commented in the 1960s or 70s. He said that if India is the most religious nation and Sweden is the most secular nation, America is a nation of Indians governed by Swedes. But that was the effect of the First Amendment. That was the effect of this free marketplace of ideas. So there is a much broader intellectual matrix that all of this is working through, and all of these pieces fit together. It is no accident, by the way, that we are seeing a deterioration in free markets, which I prefer to capitalism. We're actually seeing a deterioration of that at the same time we're seeing government bureaucracies growing. The corollary to socialism is technocracy. Okay? So in other words, if you have a socialist system of economic organization, centralized control of the economy, the political equivalent of that is technocrats running the government. And what we're seeing is that process beginning to be played out in America. So, and similarly, we're getting an increasingly driven ideological focus culturally, so that the free marketplace of ideas is similarly falling away, and a particular ideology supported by the bureaucracy and the media, big tech and all of that is similarly being imposed, because a free marketplace of ideas doesn't fit well with a bureaucratic and increasingly, frankly, socialistic or technically fascistic economic system. By the way, technical definition of fascism, it is where industry particularly and government unite and work sort of hand in glove, usually with government having the upper hand. That is the technical definition of what fascism is. And what we've got right now going on is pretty much a fascist system in many ways. You know, just let's call it what it is.
So in the past couple hundred years, would you say that there's been anybody that's been helpful for Christians in development of what you've been talking about? And combined with that question, what would you say about like Reconstructionist thinkers, Gary North, Rushton, those type of guys? Have they been helpful?
I think there have been a lot. The person I would point to that was the most helpful is Kuyper. I think that North, Rushdoony, and others were attempting to go in the right direction, but I think they put too much weight on trying to bring Bronze Age law into 20th century culture. I think that there is a lot that we can learn from the Old Testament law, but that's mostly on the level of principle. I think they were a little bit too ardent in direct application. I appreciate what they were trying to do. I don't think it was the right direction to go. I think Kuyper's approach was much more helpful. He had his problems, everybody does. But I'm much more of a Kuyperian than I would be a follower of Rushdoony or North or Dooyeweerd or any of those guys.
So I've got kind of a two-part question. So first part, if we could rewind back to the origins of America, you said that we had like the first vote you had to be president, the second would be vice president. That didn't work. And then the outcome of that was that we have the faction system. Do you think there was something structurally different that we could have done to avoid that? And then the second part is there anything you think we can do to look toward changing that, or are we kind of destined for a two-party system forever?
I am nowhere near as smart as the founding fathers were, and if they couldn't come up with a system, I doubt I could. They made a really good faith effort. And I don't know that there's any way around the problem they created. It's worth noting, by the way, that the American Constitution, the European Enlightenment figures considered it an absolute marvel. They said that, we have for 1,000 years been trying to figure out how to create a perfect Aristotelian mixed state, and these rustics across the ocean finally did it. It's an impressive feat. The problem is, there's an old saying that it's impossible to make something foolproof because fools are so ingenious. It's impossible to make something sin-proof because it is so deeply embedded, there's always going to be a way to find a way around it. Contrast this with John Locke. Locke wrote a constitution for the Carolina colonies. It is much longer than the US Constitution. And the reason it was much longer is that Locke believed that people were perfectible. And he thought if he developed a system that had every possible thing that could go wrong anticipated and ruled against, corruption would be impossible. So he had this very detailed constitution that should theoretically have stopped corruption. The problem is people always found a way around it. The founders knew that that wasn't possible. So they developed a system that was broad enough and principle-based more than detail-based, and said that this Constitution works for a moral people and no other. The only way that the Constitution works, they said very clearly, is if the people elect people of virtue to office. And in order to do that, the people themselves must be virtuous. This is something that was not new. This was well known. Again, actually, if you read Machiavelli, he'll tell you that republics only survive if the population is virtuous. So what's the solution? Develop a virtuous people. We got a lot of work to do.
So going back to resistance theory, you talked about the paradox sort of between honoring Romans 13 as learning through courage, and also in the Torah memorandum and the doctrine of the lesser magistrate, like justified resistance. And you mentioned how that's like reflected in the Declaration of Independence. But I apologize if you already addressed this and from my own ignorance, I guess. But do you think Jefferson intended for us to adhere to the idea that resistance is only okay if we're led by a lesser magistrate? And I guess in the context of the United States, where we're all subject to local authority, state authority, and then federal, we've seen recently where like certain governors kind of resist different things that are introduced and others don't. So how does that play out, I guess, for when we live in different states and our governor might not align with our beliefs?
Yeah, I think Jefferson was operating within the British framework where right of resistance is rooted in the people. But as a Republican, he expected the people to elect representatives who would act on their behalf. So I don't think he would go full lesser magistrate. He would support the right of the people, but I think, like most others, he would say lesser magistrate would be preferable, their representatives. That isn't where I thought you were going with Romans 13, by the way. But he doesn't really talk in terms of lesser magistrate. He's much more of a Lockean, and Locke roots it in the right of the people to resist. Because that's where the contract is established with the people, not with the other layers of the government. Well, let me say a quick word on Romans 13. What people ignore who are Romans 13 absolutists is that Romans 13 says that government exists to reward the good and punish the evil. It doesn't say what we're supposed to do when government rewards evil and punishes good. Doesn't address that at all. And what we're talking about here is when government fails, and government does that rather than what Romans 13 says it is there to do. So.
Don't know exactly how to ask this question, but kind of building on that, the slide that you had up toward the end that called us back to a right view of Imago Dei, original sin, all that. Is that kind of our modern resistance as Christians, which seems lower level, like on, to my neighbor basis, that kind of thing. And if so, what is our place in federal politics, affecting change through voting, all of those kind of things? What does resistance look like in both of those places, and when it's constantly changing, there's no consistency in the two-party system, between states, like she's saying, and all that?
Yeah, let's start with local activity. It's worth noting when you read in Scripture where it tells you to, put away sin, gives you a list of things, don't do these things. It always gives you a positive. So dealing with sin is not only a matter of avoiding sin, it's a matter of replacing it with something positive. So in the same way, when we're talking about resistance, especially in our context, it's not only a matter of resisting government. We're also responsible to do something positive in its place, which is why I talk about our responsibility to our neighbor, why I talk about working on developing intermediate institutions, making it so that government isn't needed in these areas. That's why I focus on that. And that's really important. And the fact is that most of us are going to have most of our impact on a local level. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have responsibilities at other levels. We are in a republic, which means that the exact text of Scripture, when it talks about our relationship with the government, doesn't exactly apply to us directly, because we have the ability to influence government in a way that Paul didn't, even as a Roman citizen. And there are many things that we can do, and we should be doing, to help influence and shape local, state, and federal government policy. We can write letters. We can lobby. We can do letters to the editor. We can do blog posts. We can run for office. We can appear at school board meetings or town council meetings. We can testify before the legislature. There's a myriad of things that we can do at that level. And if there's something serious and we don't get a response at that level, there are other things we can do. We can organize a peaceful protest. I love what they do in Moscow, Idaho, when they want to protest. They hold a psalm sing. Think about that. We can, if that doesn't work, there are further steps that we can take. There's a raft of things that we have available to us to help influence public policy and to help influence our neighbors. Chuck Colson used to say that most of our work is done across the backyard fence and at a barbecue, because he was a firm believer that politics begins at the local level. Politics is downstream from culture. Culture begins locally. So there are lots of things that we can do, and I think we've got responsibilities. Can we do all of these things? No, we've only got 24 hours a day, and most of us have to work for a living. But there are plenty of things that we can do, and we're only responsible to do what we're able to do. But we're able to do a lot more than we usually give ourselves credit for. And I would add voting falls into that category. Again, to quote Chuck Colson, his argument was that we should vote for the candidate who will do the least harm that has a chance to win.
So kind of back to the lesser magistrate versus the individual resistance conversation. Do you think Martin Luther would have been convinced by Locke if Locke is taking his argument seemingly kind of
away from a scriptural basis and more to an Enlightenment perspective?
I think that rather than Locke, it would have been a Calvinist covenantal argument if Luther had encountered the covenantal argument and then had it presented to him that way. That might have moved him, but Luther was a German, and you can always tell a German, but you can't tell him much. So I don't know. Luther could be awfully stubborn, but I think that there would have been a chance if Luther had seen sort of the covenantal argument here. There's a chance that might have moved him. But the other thing you have to keep in mind is he saw what happened during the Peasant War. He saw what happened during the Peasant Uprising, and that absolutely horrified him and terrified him. And that experience probably helped steer him away from the idea of private citizens having a right to resist. So that experience is another important factor here as well.
Two-part question. One, you talked about how when you went to a two-party system, you took away checks and balances, all those things. And you also mentioned that the framers were maybe not as full-on Christian as we would have been, but you believe that if the framers of the Constitution would have acknowledged the triune God, you're free to worship as you like, but acknowledge the triune God as being a necessary part of a moral fabric in society. Do you think that would help where we are downstream when you still see some of those problems creeping in because of sin, and so on and so forth? And then the second part is you mentioned you're more of a Kuyperian than not, or you use some other language, but Kuyper had his problems. I'm curious what criticism of Kuyper you had as far as sphere sovereignty or even as being prime minister of Holland or theologian.
Okay, yeah. With respect to the first question, I think the problem of original sin is sufficiently severe that no matter how they did it, there was no solution. State churches in Europe, they're all pretty much dead. And the reason for that is that when you develop a state church, it inevitably becomes very political. And what you get is a watered down version of Christianity. Now consider what happens with a real vaccination. Note the word real here. In a real vaccination, what you do is you give someone a weakened version of a pathogen and they develop immunity to it. State churches give people a weakened version of Christianity and they develop an immunity to it. I don't think, I think that the founders' free market approach was the best approach that we had to prevent that from happening. And it worked very well for quite a long time, until Christians basically gave up on colleges, universities, and ceded all of that to secularists, who then got progressively radicalized and indoctrinated the next generation of teachers and the next generation of professors, who then got further radicalized and so on, and now we've got what we've got here. It was a good run. And we can't necessarily say it's over because we don't know what God's got in mind. Revivals are always possible. As far as Kuyper goes, there are some racial things and stuff like that that I would have some problems with. I think his sphere of sovereignty is right on. I would have liked it if he had listed his spheres more clearly. I've got my own list that I've derived from Genesis, but it would have been nice if he'd have actually laid them out more precisely than he did. But in general, I think his sphere of sovereignty idea is right on.
One more.
We talked a lot about Leviathan in the context of, I guess, nations and specifically our own, but what would you, I guess, what would your recommendation be for slaying the global Leviathan?
That is a tougher question. I think the first step is all of the things that I talked about operating on sort of a local level. But the other part of it is to be unapologetically nationalists in the sense, not that we think that America is the perfect country or anything like that, but that we insist on the idea of national sovereignty. And that means using all of the means at our disposal to not agree to cede sovereignty from the country to international organizations like the World Health Organization or anything else. There are lots of ways that we can do that. All of the ways that I talked about in terms of influencing policy or politics locally, at the state level, national level, all of those things apply. But it's just put in a bit of a different focus. Again, insisting on not ceding national interest, national authority to multinational bodies. It's worth noting that when you go to the book of Revelation, you will find people from every nation worshiping God. Nations are something that is part of God's created order. They're something that God approves of. The idea of a global, one world, homogenized thing, that's Babel. It's not part of God's plan. The table of nations, the 70 nations that are listed in Genesis, it's worth noting that the table of nations comes before Babel. The idea of homogenization, one world, all of that kind of thing, that's what God condemned at Babel. So there's nothing wrong with nationalism. It becomes wrong when the nation turns into an idol. But we should continue to insist that national sovereignty is a good and valuable thing. Okay, there was actually one more hand in back, which I think would be, her hand was up for a while.
Trying to think of how to word this exactly, but I guess talking on the local level, people level, seeing the comparison between the American Revolution and the French Revolution, it seems like if you're looking at America today, you have two very diametrically opposed revolutionary ideas in America right now, which seems like that's where the seeds of, if you listen to conversations of civil war, how do you not have those two revolutions clash right now? Like, I don't see how you don't. So help me insight on that.
Yeah, America is as divided now as it has been since the Civil War. We are faced with a frankly totalitarian ideology on the one side and a frankly confused mess on the other. I don't know how you avoid violence after the next election. I don't know how that happens. I don't know if civil war is likely. There are people who think it is. There are people who think it isn't. Maybe I'm too much of an optimist, but I tend to think not. But a great deal of internal strife and a great deal of trouble economically and frankly globally as a result of American weakness seems probable to me. What do we do about this? We do what we can. All of the kinds of things I've talked about before in terms of our involvement in politics apply, but there's one thing that I have not mentioned that is the single most important thing that we can do, and that's pray. People tend to consider prayer sort of a last resort or kind of poo-poo the idea of praying as if it, yeah, like that's going to do anything. It's actually the single most powerful weapon we've got. And although I've been talking about these things on a purely sort of external, visible level, the fact of the matter is, scripturally, we are told that our battle isn't against flesh and blood, and that every issue that we are facing in the world today has supernatural entities that are behind it. Nations do, we know that from Daniel and Ezekiel. I think it's pretty clear that many of the things that are going on culturally, particularly the LGBTQ stuff, there are spiritual forces that are at work behind that. And at the end of the day, anything that we do that doesn't address that will never solve the problem. So what we need to be doing is spending a great deal of time, concentrated effort, and focus in prayer without neglecting the other. And ultimately, that's, at the end of the day, that's the last answer. Because the root cause of all of these things is not in the visible, it's in the invisible. And so we have to take the fight to that level, not just think about political action, writing letters, protests, or whatever. We have to take it to the level of spiritual conflict and operate there.
In the last chapter of your book, you have, I think, a quote from Benjamin Franklin.
Yep.
And he's, we think of him as a deist.
Mm-hmm.
And could you expand on that?
Yeah. Franklin said at the Continental Congress, at the Constitutional Convention, when they were having problems trying to figure out what they wanted to do and there was conflict, he said that, this is a gross paraphrase, but he said that during the American Revolution, they opened every meeting of the Continental Congress with prayer. And they saw results from that prayer. There were times where I think he used the phrase something like the undeniable hand of providence in response to prayer. And as we are trying to establish this new country, can we possibly do so without the benefit of the hand of providence? And so he proposed that they open every session with prayer, because without God's benevolent hand, they would never be able to establish the nation. That's, by the way, concrete proof that Franklin was not a deist, because deists did not believe in prayer. He saw the founding of the nation as an issue. He wouldn't put it this way, and I think he'd cringe at me putting it this way, but he saw the founding of the nation as a matter of spiritual warfare. We need to think the same way.
Well, thank you, Dr. Sunshine. He has served us well.
Thank you.